She gave him a son, and for that, she bled to death. History remembers Henry VIII for many things: the broken churches, the shattered marriages, the wives who lost their heads, or their titles, or their dignity but buried quietly beneath the louder stories, is the name of Jane Seymour, the pale girl with downcast eyes, the one who said very little, smiled even less, and still managed to give the most dangerous man in England the one thing no woman before her could: a living, breathing, crying male heir. A prince born in blood and pain on the cold floors of Hampton Court. That son would become Edward VI, King of England, and his mother would never see him grow. It's easy to romanticize Jane, to call her the good queen, the gentle wife, the one who succeeded where Catherine and Anne failed. But the truth is harder, darker, and soaked in fever. Jane didn't survive long enough to enjoy her crown. In fact, the crown may have killed her, because her entire queenship from wedding to coffin lasted barely 17 months. And within 12 days of childbirth, Jane Seymour was dead. They say her labour began on the afternoon of the 9th of October, in the year 1537, and that she screamed through the stone corridors for nearly 3 days. Some whispered that her body was stretched and pulled to make way for the baby who refused to come. Others murmured she was cut open while still alive, that her womb was sliced to deliver the heir before her soul could leave her body. There were even darker rumours that when the physicians turned to the king and asked who they should save, the mother or the child, Henry answered coldly, "The boy. I can always find another wife, whether true or not." The air around her death is heavy. With that same indifference, a woman reduced to a vessel, a means to a royal end, a breathing sacrifice on the altar of succession. Jane survived the birth. Barely. Edward was born in the early morning of the 12th of October, and for a few fleeting days, it seemed she might recover. She smiled weakly. She signed letters, announcing the birth of her son. She even received visitors while Edward was christened with silver and incense and Latin prayers. But beneath her silken sheets, infection crept like rot. The fever came quietly at first. A subtle flush in the cheeks, a chill in the bones, the kind of sickness women whispered about but never named aloud. Then came the sweats, the shivering, the vomiting, the bleeding. By the 15th of October, she was sitting up in bed, but her skin had already turned the wrong shade, and the warmth in her voice had dulled. Doctors and priests surrounded her. They spoke of hope. They offered prayers, but behind closed doors, they began to prepare for mourning. By the 19th of October, Jane was visibly worse. Her body began to betray her. Some blamed puerperal fever. Others, food poisoning. And still others, the great cold she caught when they allowed her to eat what she pleased in her delirium. None of it mattered. What mattered was that she was slipping away, and there was nothing, no doctor, no midwife, no prayer that could pull her back. Henry was summoned to her bedside on the Tuesday. They sat together, the king and the dying girl, in the same chambers where Edward had been born, the same bed, the same walls. He held her hand. He prayed with her. Maybe he wept, but he did not stay long. He left before dawn, and by 2 in the morning, on the 24th of October, Jane Seymour was dead. They said the palace went silent, that the staff stopped speaking above a whisper, that the candles burned lower than usual. But Henry did not scream. He did not fall to his knees. He did not order the bells to toll immediately. Instead, he turned inward, retreating to Windsor, leaving the details of her funeral to others. The Duke of Norfolk organized the procession. The physicians embalmed her body. Her organs were removed, her insides stuffed with herbs and cloth and clove-studded apples to delay the rot. Her body was dressed in gold, her crown placed upon her brow, and she was laid in state for days. watched over by silent guards who stood without blinking as England lost its queen. There was no scandal, no annulment, no trial, no accusations of witchcraft or treason or adultery. Jane Seymour was the only one who died a queen. And perhaps that is why she's remembered as the one he loved most. Not because she captured his heart, but because she died before he could change his mind. Years later, when Henry lay dying himself, bloated and broken and nearly unrecognizable, he gave orders that he be buried beside her. Not Catherine, not Anne, not the others who followed. Just Jane, the woman who gave him a son, the woman who did her duty, the woman who didn't live long enough to disappoint him. And so, 500 years later, the bones of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour still lie side by side beneath the stones of St. George's Chapel at Windsor. A king who killed for power, and the queen who died to give him what he wanted most. A pair locked forever in death, joined not by love, but by lineage. This is not the end of Jane's story. It's only the first breath of it. For what comes next is the quiet horror of her funeral, the politics of her memory, the mourning that wasn't quite mourning, and the royal child who grew up without the mother who gave him life. And that's where we go next, before the crown, before the child, before the fever that took her. Jane Seymour stood at the edge of the Tudor court like a ghost half-sketched in ink, a pale girl in a darker world. Clothed in modest grey, with eyes that lowered themselves before they were ever asked to. She was not loud, she was not bold, and she was never meant to be queen. But in a palace of thunder and betrayal, sometimes the quietest breath becomes the last sound that matters. She had been born into a noble but quiet family, far from the intrigue of London, in the green heartlands of England, where prayers echoed softly in wooden chapels, and girls were taught to fold their hands before they learned to lift their heads. Her father was Sir John Seymour of Wolfhall, a man with enough pedigree to be noticed but not enough to shake the foundations of the realm. And her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, was a woman of good breeding and gentle ways. Jane was one of many siblings, and nothing about her childhood promised greatness, nor hinted that her name would ever be whispered by kings or mourned by nations. She could read and write, but not in Latin. She could sew delicate patterns into silk, but not argue philosophy. She could sing softly and play the lute with grace, but she could not hold a crowd with words. She was, in every sense, ordinary, until she became something else entirely. When she arrived at court, it was not as a star but as a servant, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, and later to Anne Boleyn. She moved silently through the corridors of power, listening to conversations that were not meant for her, brushing past whispers of betrayal and ambition without ever claiming any of it for herself. And perhaps it was in this silence that Henry saw her, not because she sparkled, but because she didn't. He had grown tired of fire. Anne Boleyn burned too brightly. Her wit was sharp, her laughter too loud, her presence a constant challenge to his authority. She had won him through war of minds, of bodies, of countries even. And he, who had broken his marriage, his church, and his kingdom to have her, had slowly grown weary of the very flame he once chased. And there, just behind Anne's throne, stood Jane, quiet, watchful, patient. They say the first gift was a locket, the second a letter, the third a promise. No one knows when exactly the king began to see her, not as a servant, but as salvation. But the shift was as certain as winter after harvest. Anne saw it, too. How could she not? In every hall where Jane stood, Anne's name rang with less pride and more fear. The Queen knew the scent of replacement, long before the final blow fell. But Jane, for all the accusations later flung at her, did not reach for the crown. She did not plot. She did not poison. She did not dance in the moonlight with her ambition held high. What she did was wait. Wait in the shadows. Wait behind the heavy velvet curtains of palace rooms. Wait for her name to be called forward. Not shouted. She did not seduce. She endured. And in the world of Henry Tudor, that was often enough. After Anne's arrest, after the trial that twisted the truth into execution, Jane was taken quietly to a remote manor while the axe was sharpened. She did not watch the tower. She did not celebrate. She did not weep. When the news came that Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, had been beheaded by a French swordsman, Jane did not dance. She dressed in white, a strange echo of mourning or purity, or perhaps both. And just 11 days later, she was married to the king. There was no parade, no great coronation, no fireworks or fanfare. Jane Seymour's queenship began, not with joy, but with a breath held in the dark, a question of what it meant to wear the crown of a woman whose blood had not yet dried. But Jane wore it, lightly. She spoke little in public. She did not meddle in matters of state. Her only ambition, if she had one, was peace. Peace between Henry and his daughter Mary, whom he had cast aside with her mother. Peace between the court factions that had torn themselves into ribbons. Peace within the king's own mind, which swung like a pendulum between love and rage. And Henry, strangely, listened. She asked him gently, not forcefully, to bring Mary back into the fold. She wrote with her own hand, soft and pleading, to the daughter of the woman she had replaced. She called her sister and begged for reconciliation. And when Mary returned, not with celebration, but with caution, Jane stood beside her in silence. She did not gloat. She did not claim victory. She only smiled, faintly, like someone who had finally exhaled after years of holding her breath. But the court was watching. It always watches. And for all her restraint, Jane Seymour now held the most dangerous position in England, the mother-in-waiting to a son that had not yet been born. And if she failed, she would not be remembered for her peace or her patience. She would be discarded, quietly, of course, but discarded all the same. So she prayed. She fasted. She submitted herself to the rituals of holiness, wore saintly tokens, surrounded herself with physicians and midwives. She did everything right. And when she finally announced her pregnancy, the court exhaled with her. Because Jane Seymour was not just carrying a child, she was carrying the future of the Tudor dynasty. And somewhere, in the long dark corridors of Hampton Court, she began to disappear. Her figure grew frailer, her skin paler, her smiles rarer still. The stress of carrying the king's hope pressed against her bones. And by the time October came, she had already begun to fade into myth. But she waited. She had always waited. Waited in the shadows. Waited behind Anne Boleyn's throne. Waited for Henry to turn toward her. Not with lust, but with need. Waited through the early months of her queenship, when the country still whispered the name of the woman she replaced. Waited through silence. Through suspicion. Through suspicion turned to belief. Through belief turned to hope. And then the pain came. 3 days of labor. 3 days of screaming. Of praying. Of bleeding. And after all that, a son. And in the room that had held her cries, she was crowned again, not with jewels or velvet, but with fever. The fire would take her slowly, quietly, just as she had lived. But that is a story for tomorrow. Tonight, we let her rest. In the shadows she once knew so well. The sun had long since dipped below the rooftops of Hampton Court when the first pains began. Faint at first, like the tightening of some invisible ribbon deep inside her belly. A whisper in the blood that perhaps the time had come. It was the 9th of October, a cold autumn afternoon, where the river flowed slower than usual, and the air around the palace had turned crisp with the scent of wood smoke and rain, somewhere far beyond the chamber walls. The court was busy with arrangements, with linen and broth and gossip, but within Jane Seymour's private apartments, the silence had shifted, and it would not return for 3 long, aching days. They came slowly at first. Those contractions, stealing her breath and returning it with cruel rhythm, one after another like waves breaking against the shore of her bones. And she, always so still, so composed, so made of hush and grace, began to tense. The maids noticed first the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hands clutched the armrests of her carved chair, the tight corners of her mouth pressed into something almost unrecognizable. She had been waiting for this moment for months, for this, the culmination of her entire queenship, and now that it was here, her body had betrayed her by refusing to yield. They laid her down by evening. The midwives came in clusters of 2, then 3, then 5, whispering to one another behind fans and folded palms. They brought warm towels and wooden bowls, boiled water in heavy copper pots, and lit candles until the room shimmered like a chapel of sweat and wax. Prayers were murmured without conviction. Psalms versung unter breath. But Jane did not cry out. Not yet. She gritted her teeth, pressed her face into the silk pillow, and bore the waves in silence. For hours, then for longer, the pain, when it truly arrived, was not like pain at all. It was something else, something deeper. It rose from within her, not as a scream, but as a shattering of bones, of reason, of self. It tore through her spine and stomach and lungs. It stretched her hips into aching halves. It pressed down like a mountain upon her ribs until she could barely breathe, barely think, barely remember who she had been before this room. They told her to push, then to stop, then to breathe, and her body, drenched in effort, obeyed until it could obey no more. The first night passed with no result. By dawn on the 10th, she was shivering. Damp cloths were placed across her brow, and lavender was burnt near the windows. She no longer spoke. She barely opened her eyes. Some said her lips moved, forming prayers to the Virgin, to Saint Margaret, to the God who had promised mercy and given her only fire. Her ladies-in-waiting wept in corners. Her brother stood at the door, pale and useless. And the king stayed away. He had been told it would be difficult, and he did not wish to see his chosen wife in this state. He sent a message, a cloak, a whispered blessing, but he did not come. Midday came and went. Still no child. Jane had begun to moan now, not screams. Not yet, but a sound lower and heavier, the sound of something being split in two. Her breath came in gasps, her voice now hoarse. Her lips cracked. She gripped the sheets until her knuckles turned white, then red, then white again. And through it all, the midwives whispered. They whispered about the child who would not turn, about the bones that had not shifted enough, about the blood that came too soon and too much, and the danger that pressed against the edge of everything. By evening, panic had arrived. They summoned the best physicians in the kingdom. The palace doors opened and closed in flurries of boots and velvet, surgeons confrères. Priests waited in the hall. Somewhere, perhaps even in that very room, someone asked a question no one dared, voiced too loudly. What if the child cannot come? What if she cannot survive it? And the answer, cold and royal, may have been given. Some accounts say that the king was asked to choose. Some say that he did not hesitate. Save the boy. He may have said, I can always find another wife. And so the whispers turned darker. There were rumors. Later, only rumors that Jane had begged for them to cut the child from her womb, that she had screamed for death to come quicker, that her arms had to be held down, that her womb was opened while her heart still beat. No one knows the truth. No records survive of any cesarean. No eyewitnesses speak clearly. No journal confirms it. But in the quiet hours of the second night, when her body had stopped responding, when her eyes no longer focused, the birth began to change. The pain did not leave, but it no longer belonged to her. It had become something else, something done to her, and the room fell quiet as the midwives leaned in. At last, sometime around 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, a sound broke the stillness. A cry, sharp and sudden and full of fury. A boy, alive. Edward, the boy king, the heir, the golden child. He had come at last. There was no celebration in the chamber. There were no trumpets, no songs, only exhaustion, only the smell of blood and ash, only Jane, lying pale and damp and far too quiet, her chest barely rising, her lips already cold. They wrapped the child in linen and took him from her arms. She had not the strength to hold him. She may not even have seen him. And still, the court rejoiced. The news spread like fire. A prince, a Tudor heir. The line-secured bonfires were lit. Bells were rung. The people cheered and drank and toasted the health of the mother who had given her life to England. But they did not know she was already dying. In the hours that followed, Jane faded. On the 13th she smiled. On the 14th, she spoke a few words. On the 15th, she sat up in bed and received guests. She held their hands. She offered thanks. She whispered, perhaps, that she was recovering. But by the 19th, the fever had returned, and by the 24th, she was gone. The labour had torn her open in every way. Body, mind, soul. She had been delivered not just of a child, but of herself. What remained was shadow, a queen in name only, a mother who would never be called Mama, a woman remembered not for her life, but for how it ended. And yet, even now, even here, in the aching quiet of death's long corridor, there is something else. Peace. Because Jane Seymour had always waited for Henry, waited for purpose, waited for her time to matter. And in that room, in that bed, in those days that blurred the line between birth and burial, she became more than the quiet girl in the background. She became legend. But legends don't end in childbirth. They echo. And tomorrow, in the silence, after her last breath, we'll listen for the world that kept spinning without her. The prince was born in darkness, and in darkness he slept. They wrapped him in white linen, soft as breath, embroidered with golden thread, and laid him in a cradle carved from oak and polished to mirror-like smoothness. The work of a dozen royal craftsmen who had spent months preparing for this moment, though none of them truly believed it would come. And now here he was, small, red-faced, blinking at the candlelight with the indifference of a newborn who knew nothing of crowns, of thrones, of the silence that had already begun to settle beyond the chamber door. They rocked him gently, not with lullabies, not with laughter, but with caution, as if too much motion might tear something in the air, as if the room still held its breath, because the Queen, his mother, had not yet left the bed. She was alive, or so they said. The midwives whispered that her colour was returning. The priests said their prayers had worked. The women who had knelt by her side during the worst of the labour now walked the halls with cautious hope pressed against their lips. And on the 13th of October, just one day after the child was born, Jane Seymour smiled. It was a small smile, faint and pale, as if borrowed from a memory of herself before the pain began. But it was enough to stir the halls. The Queen was recovering. The court exhaled. The King, too, smiled from a distance. He did not come to her chambers that day. He had other matters now to present the child, to plan the christening, to write to foreign courts announcing the arrival of the boy who would be king. And still, Jane lay in bed. Her hands were cold, her skin damp. Her eyes did not open for long. She spoke few words of blessing. A name, a murmur for water. Her hair clung to her neck. The bedsheets beneath her had been changed more than once, stained with something the maids did not dare describe aloud. But still they said she would live. By the 15th, she was sitting up. Visitors were allowed in. Courtiers came with gifts and congratulations. Some brought flowers. Others offered prayers. A few brought rumours, tucked behind smiles that perhaps the labour had been too long, that perhaps the child had been born with force, that perhaps the queen had been cut open, but they said nothing directly. They bowed, they curtsied, they kissed her hand, light as a feather, and withdrew. Later that day, as the bells of the palace tolled softly for the start of the christening, Jane Seymour was helped to sit upright in her bed. A robe of soft ivory was placed across her shoulders. Her hair was combed gently. Perfume was dabbed behind her ears. She would not attend the ceremony, but she would receive guests. She would smile. She would bear witness to the joy she had purchased with her body. The christening was held by candlelight. It was a spectacle of silver and silence, of cloaks trimmed with ermine, of Latin chants that echoed through the stone chapel like prayers thrown into a vast sea. The baby, now named Edward, was carried in by noble hands. He squirmed once, then slept, and outside, in the shadows of Hampton Court, the world held its breath for the next chapter of the Tudor line. But in her room, the Queen was beginning to sink. The fever returned that night. It began quietly, a flush in the cheeks, a dryness on the lips, a shifting of weight that no one noticed until it was too late. She whispered strange words in her sleep. She shivered despite the heavy wool blankets. The candlelight seemed too bright for her eyes, and by the time the visitors left, Jane was no longer smiling. By the 17th, she could not sit up. By the 19th, she could not eat. They brought broth. She refused it. They brought wine. She turned her head. She coughed, low and ragged, and the sound turned the stomachs of those who heard it. It was not the cough of recovery. It was something deeper, something that rattled from the lungs down into the bones. Some blamed natural lacks. Others said it was exhaustion. One doctor mentioned childbed fever. Another whispered about sepsis. Though he used no such word, they spoke in vague terms. As men often did when faced with a woman's suffering they could not explain. The king was informed. He frowned. He prayed. But he did not enter the room. Jane, for her part, said little. When she was awake, she stared out the window. When she was asleep, she turned away from the light. The cradle was kept nearby. But she had not held her son. Not truly. She had seen him once, maybe twice. She had smiled at him. She had touched his hand. But she had not rocked him. She had not whispered to him. She had not called him by name. The fever rose. On the 22nd of October, the court was told to prepare. By the 23rd, the priests returned to her side. She was given last rites in the soft hush of early morning. Her hands, once gentle and skilled in embroidery, now shook too much to hold the crucifix. It was pressed between her palms. Her lips moved in silent confession. And those who watched her ladies, her brothers, her physicians knew what she did not say. She had done everything right. And still, she was dying. When the king came at last, it was too late. He sat by her side. He held her hand. He wept. Perhaps, or perhaps he did not. There are no records of his tears, only of his presence. He stayed a few hours. then left again. And when the clock struck 2, in the quietest hour of the 24th of October, Queen Jane Seymour exhaled her final breath. She had given England a son, and England had taken her life. Down the hall, in another room, the cradle rocked gently on its own. The child slept. The fever had risen, and the woman who had waited in the shadows, who had endured the pain, who had asked for nothing but to hold her son, was gone. The bells did not ring that night, but they would soon. It is a strange thing, to die a queen, and yet leave behind so little of yourself. No diaries, no final speech, no grand instructions for the future, no trembling farewell recorded in ink, only whispers, only fragments, only the kind of words passed from hand to hand, from servant to priest to courtier, like dried petals in a folded letter, faded, fragile, barely believable. But they say she spoke. Before the silence, before the end, they say her voice was softer than ever, not hoarse, but hollow, as though it came from a long corridor she was already walking down. She did not scream. She did not cry. She asked, once, if her son was well, and when they said yes, oh, yes, Your Grace. He is strong. He feeds well. He sleeps. She closed her eyes and smiled. Just briefly. That smile, they said, was the last thing her maid saw before she turned away to fetch warm water. By the time she returned, Jane had begun to drift, and soon after, she began to die. She was 30 years old, perhaps 29. No one is quite sure. In a palace filled with records, her exact age had not mattered until now, and now that it mattered, no one dared ask. Outside her chamber, the halls had already changed. The laughter had stopped. The doors had been closed gently. Too gently. The bustle of celebration after Edward's birth had vanished, replaced by hushed movements, hurried steps, and servants who avoided one another's eyes. The cradle had been moved. The room cleared of flowers. The musicians sent home without being paid. Even the royal physicians had started to say less, and when men who once prided themselves on knowledge begin to speak in half sentences, it means they already know the outcome, though they fear the formality of declaring it. On the morning of the 24th of October, Jane Seymour lay between layers of linen, her body still warm, but her voice nearly gone. They say she turned her head to the side and asked for the window to be opened. Not for light, there was no sun that day. Only a thick greyness that pressed against the glass, but for air. A breeze. Perhaps to remind her of Wolf Hall. Of home? They say she whispered her father's name, then her mother's, then said nothing for a long time. No one knows what she saw in those final hours. Some say she kept her eyes closed. Others say she looked at the ceiling as though something was written there. A few swore she spoke to someone not in the room. But beyond it, a sister, maybe, or a saint, or a dream. One maid claimed she heard Jane whisper St. Margaret again and again, the patron of childbirth. Another insisted she heard Jane repeat the name Edward, not her son, but her brother. But it is also possible, and perhaps more honest, that she said nothing at all. Because death, in its last moments, is rarely poetic. It does not wait for eloquence. It does not listen for legacy. It comes as breath that refuses to return, as eyes that will not blink, as fingers that no longer curl. And when it came for Jane, it came quietly, almost politely, as though it knew she would not resist. She was not the kind of woman to fight the inevitable. She had endured too much already. There are no records of what Henry said when he received the news. No letters, no declarations, no explosion of grief. He did not tear his robes, as he once did for Anne. He did not shut himself away for days. He simply left, rode to Windsor, and there, surrounded by tapestries and foreign ambassadors and the beginnings of funeral arrangements. He began to plan what came next. But this much is clear: Jane Seymour died, a queen. The only one of Henry's wives to do so. No disgrace. No trial. No divorce. No beheading. No exile. No banishment to a silent country house. She died with her title intact, her place in the world unchallenged. And perhaps that, in its own strange way, is why she is remembered not for her laughter, not for her politics, not even for her beauty, but for her ending. Still, there were some who blamed others. They whispered that her attendants had let her catch cold, that she had been allowed to eat meat when her stomach could not bear it, that her rooms had not been kept warm enough, that her midwives had pushed too soon, pulled too hard, waited too long. In Tudor England, when a woman died in childbirth, someone must always be blamed, and it was never the crown. A priest who had seen her just after her passing wrote that her skin had gone pale as paper dipped in milk, and that her lips were neither blue nor red, but something between. He said she still looked like herself, but smaller, as though death had reduced her, not just in size, but in presence. They embalmed her by candlelight, removed the organs, cleaned the body, combed her hair, folded her hands, and laid her gently back into the bed, where her son had been born. The same room, the same light, the same ceiling. Her heart, some say, was buried separately beneath the high altar at Hampton Court, in the place where prayers were offered every morning. But her body was dressed in gold, a robe heavy with thread and jewels, a crown placed softly on her brow. She lay in state for days. They say people wept upon seeing her, not because they knew her, but because she looked too peaceful, too final, like a statue carved to resemble mercy. She did not look like a woman who had screamed for 3 days, or one who had slipped into death beneath fever and blood. She looked at last like a queen. Her stepdaughter Mary, child of Catherine of Aragon, would ride at the front of the funeral procession. 29 ladies followed behind, one for each year of Jane's short life. Edward was not present. He was too young, too delicate, too symbolic to be risked. And so the Queen's son did not attend her burial. But her brother did. Her husband did not. Henry stayed behind, away from the mourners, away from the stone vault where she was laid, away from the crowds who lined the roads and threw flowers beneath the wheels of the black-draped carriage that carried her coffin to Windsor. And so Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, mother of Edward VI, Queen of England for just over a year, was lowered into the darkness beneath St. George's Chapel. The staves of office were broken. The bells tolled. 200 masses were ordered for the peace of her soul. And the world moved on. The boy would become king. The king would marry again. And Jane quiet. Patient Jane would remain where they left her. A memory. A name. A face in a portrait whose eyes never looked directly at you. The queen who gave him everything, and asked for nothing in return. But maybe, just maybe, her last words were not spoken aloud. Maybe they were felt. And maybe, even now, if you walk the halls of Hampton Court in the deep hours of night, if you stand beside the empty cradle, if you place your palm on the cold stone beneath the altar, you will hear them. Was he worth it? The Queen was dead. And still the king did not come. They waited for him. At first, in the antechambers, in the torchlit halls of Hampton Court, in the rooms where the air smelled of rosemary and myrrh and something else beneath it, the sweet decay of something once alive. The servants changed the drapes from crimson to black. The guards at the gate wore bands of mourning silk tied around their arms. The royal physicians stopped speaking altogether. But still, the king did not come. It was said that Henry was at Windsor, that he was praying, that he was weeping, that he had taken to his bed, but no one truly knew, because no one was allowed to ask, He had given one order, and one order only. She is to be buried as a queen, and then he vanished from her story. It was the 1st of November, when the declaration was made. Jane Seymour would be buried with full royal honours, the same rights given to Elizabeth of York, the long-dead mother of Henry himself. The court was commanded to wear mourning black. The bells of London would toll. A procession would stretch from palace to chapel. Hundreds of candles would burn. 200 masses would be sung. There would be no half measures, nor hesitation, no shame. But the king, the husband, would not be present. It was not so unusual. They told each other. Monarchs did not always attend funerals. It was tradition. It was dignity. It was the preservation of strength. But they all knew, quietly, behind their half-lowered eyes and murmured platitudes, that it was more than that. That it was grief not too little, but too much. Or perhaps not grief at all. The coffin was sealed on the 6th day after her death. Her body had been embalmed by moonlight, her heart and entrails removed and buried beneath the high altar of the palace chapel, the same chapel where she had once knelt as queen, where her ladies had sung her praises, where Henry had looked upon her with the cold, satisfied gaze of a man whose desire had been fulfilled. Now, she lay in silence. The coffin was lined in lead, as was custom, to preserve the remains during the journey. The lid was closed with care. Her effigy was placed atop a painted wooden likeness, carved by men who had never spoken to her, painted by hands that had never heard her voice. The effigy smiled faintly, her painted lips the same soft shade of pink she had worn in life, her hair golden, her crown delicate. But the woman beneath the lid had already turned pale as parchment. The procession began before dawn on the 8th of November. 6 black horses pulled the carriage. 12 riders in mourning rode ahead. Behind them, 29 ladies on horseback, one for each year of Jane Seymour's life. And at their head rode Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the girl once banished from court who now, in the strange order of things, led the funeral of the woman who had tried to bring her home. She did not smile. She did not weep. She rode with her head high and her veil heavy. Behind them came the clergy, bishops in white, monks in silence, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who had baptized Edward only days earlier, now walked beneath a black canopy, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the ground. And behind all this, the servants, the soldiers, the watchers, hundreds of them. Most had never known Jane Seymour, but still they came. Still they walked. Still they watched. Because this, they knew, was history being laid to rest. The road from Hampton Court to Windsor was long. Cold wind blew through the branches. The leaves beneath the hooves were wet and broken. The sky did not brighten. The sun stayed hidden. As if out of respect, the procession reached Windsor on the 10th of November, and there, just outside St. George's Chapel, they stopped. Jane's coffin was removed with ceremony, her effigy carried behind on a velvet-draped board. The chapel doors were opened. The organ played low and deep, like a breath held too long, and the Queen entered her final home. Inside, the chapel was dark but warm. Candles lined the walls. The choir stood waiting. The vault had already been prepared, a chamber beneath the floor. Not yet grand, not yet finished, meant to one day be the foundation of a vast tomb. The king had begun to imagine a tomb for them both, because Henry had given one more instruction, one no one dared speak of directly, that when his time came, whenever it might be, he was to be laid beside her. No one questioned it, no one dared, and so they lowered her down. The choir sang, the archbishop spoke, the bells tolled, and when the coffin reached the bottom of the vault, when the final prayers had been said, Jane's royal staff, the women who had dressed her, fed her, waited by her door, stepped forward. One by one, they took the symbols of their office, silver keys, staffs of authority, white gloves, embroidered sashes, and broke them, snapped them in half, shattered them across their knees. Then, with quiet dignity, they dropped them into the grave, a gesture as old as monarchy itself, a sign that her service had ended. Above, the organ fell silent, and for a moment, just one, the entire chapel stood still. Then the lid was closed, the vault sealed, the stone replaced, and Jane Seymour, Queen of England, was gone from sight. They left the chapel in silence. Mary did not look back. The horses were reharnessed, the effigy placed in storage, the mourning gowns folded and hung, the candle wax scraped from the floor, and within a week, the court resumed. Music returned, dances were held, men laughed again, and the king began to eat again. They said he wore black for 3 months, that he did not remarry for 3 years, that he spoke of Jane often, that he called her my true wife, that he ordered her name to be remembered in every mass, said at court, but he did not attend her funeral, and he never looked inside the vault, not even when they built his own. For in the years to come, the great tomb he had designed for them both was never finished. Funds were redirected, plans abandoned, wars came, queens came and went, sculptors died, stones were left uncarved, and so, when Henry VIII himself died in the year 1547, bloated and broken and too sick to speak, they placed his coffin quietly, without procession beside hers. In the same vault, in the dark, no grand monument above, no statue, no inscription, just 2 bodies beneath the floor, beneath the prayers, beneath the feet of history, together, at last, but not as lovers, not as husband and wife, as king and queen, as memory and myth, as silence, sealed in stone. She had not expected to be called for, nor had she expected to be needed, nor had she asked for a place in this story. Yet somehow, when the crown began to tilt and the veil was lifted from the lifeless face of the third queen, it was Mary who stepped forward, not as the orphan daughter of a cast-off wife, not as the discarded Catholic relic in a kingdom reshaped by her father's desires, but as the only one left who understood how pain could wrap itself around duty until the two became indistinguishable. And so she came, silent and straight-backed, with her black cloak heavy upon her shoulders, and her hands gloved not for the weather, but for the memory of the woman who had tried quietly, perhaps too quietly, to bring her back into the light. Mary Tudor had known exile in her own home, had dined alone when others feasted. I had watched her title vanish, like breath in frost, had been forced to sign declarations that declared her own mother unlawful, and her own blood illegitimate. And yet, in the final year of Jane Seymour's life, Mary had been summoned not by her father, but by the soft intercessions of the new queen, who had spoken on her behalf in corridors and chambers, had written to her with warm words and careful grace, and had extended something close to reconciliation across the cold divide of a broken family. And though Mary had never called Jane mother, and Jane had never called Mary daughter, there was something between them that resembled kinship more than power. And now, with Jane gone, it was Mary who remained. She rode at the front of the procession, draped in mourning black, her face pale and still beneath the weight of her veil, her hands holding the reins of her horse with the quiet dignity of a woman who had outlived her place in the story. And behind her rode 29 women, chosen not for their rank but for their number, for each was meant to represent a year in Jane Seymour's brief life. And so they came, in silence, a trail of dark figures, on horseback, moving through the grey November mist from Hampton Court to Windsor, a ghostly ribbon threading through the countryside, watched, not with cheers, but with reverence. As peasants stood by the roadside with heads bowed and caps removed, as monks knelt in the ditches and whispered prayers, as children clutched their mothers' hands without understanding why the world had suddenly gone so quiet. Mary did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned long ago that tears were a language too easily misunderstood at court, and because the act of mourning, for here, had never been about display, but about endurance. And so she rode, upright and unflinching, as bells tolled low in the distance and the coffin creaked softly behind her. And when they reached the gates of Windsor, when the great chapel doors were opened, and the clergy began to chant their ancient dirges, she dismounted without help, walked steadily down the nave, with the dignity of a princess unrecognized, and stood beside the grave of the woman who had once made space for her in a world that had pushed her aside. The crowd watched her. They had expected to see the king, but the king did not come. Instead, they saw the daughter, the wronged one, the quiet one, the one who had once signed her name, the king's humble servant even after he had declared her a bastard. And now here she was, mourning, not a mother, not even a friend, but a woman who had remembered her when no one else had. And in that remembrance had restored something Mary had not dared to hope for the right to be seen. She kept vigil that night beside the coffin, when others went to sleep, when the candles burned low and the chapel fell into stillness. She remained, seated at the foot of the bier, her head bowed in prayer, not speaking, not moving, just breathing slowly in the dark, as if by her presence she could give the dead queen something more than the rituals of state, as if by staying she could stitch shut the wound between them, that space where Jane had tried to offer kindness, but had never lived long enough to finish the work. The next morning, she stood beside the vault as the body was lowered. She watched as the Queen's staff broke their staves and tossed them into the grave. Symbols of service ended, and as the stones were rolled into place, as the Latin filled the air like incense, she did not flinch, did not cross herself until the final Amen. And then, when it was done, when the chapel had swallowed Jane Seymour into its belly of stone, Mary turned, walked alone past the rows of bowed heads, mounted her horse once more, and rode away in silence. They would not speak of her much in the days to come. They would speak of the child, Edward VI, the precious Tudor heir who had survived. They would speak of the king, Henry VIII, the grieving monarch who disappeared into private mourning. They would speak of the tomb, the masses, the crown that sat upon the dead queen's hair, but they would not speak of Mary. Because Mary was not part of the celebration, she was the shadow in the aisle, the reminder that not every wound in the palace came with ceremony. And yet it was she who carried the weight of that day. It was she who gave the funeral its soul. For what is a royal death, without a daughter to lead it? The stones beneath St. George's Chapel were cold and thick with silence, carved not for comfort, but for permanence. And beneath them, in the dark vault, where the world no longer reached, Jane Seymour was laid to rest beside nothing and no one, her coffin lowered gently into the earth, with promises that would echo far longer than the love that inspired them. For above her head, carved into parchment and passed through royal hands, was a design intricate, massive, blinding in its imagined grandeur of a tomb that would never be finished, a monument that would never be built, a resting place more symbolic than real, planned not only as a tribute to the wife who had died a queen, but as a final cathedral to the man who could not bear to be forgotten. They had planned it in gold. They had drawn it in ink and gilded it with Latin. It was to be the largest royal tomb England had ever seen, greater than the one built for Edward the Confessor, grander than the resting place of Henry V, more enduring than the stone sarcophagus that once held Eleanor of Aquitaine. It would rise above the vault like a second chapel, guarded by bronze angels, pierced with alabaster light, with two effigies in the center, the king and the queen, lying side by side in eternal stillness, hands clasped, not in affection, but in fate. But fate, as always, had other plans. The masons began their work. The sketches were passed to foreign craftsmen. Orders were sent for the finest marble, for gilded canopies, for cherubs whose faces would be modelled on the young Prince Edward. And somewhere in the private chambers of Windsor, or the closed study of Whitehall, Henry wrote that this tomb would bear his name forever, that he would not be like the others, that his body would not vanish into legend without stone to hold it. But years passed, and the marble did not come, and the funds began to thin. The wars grew longer, the enemies more numerous, the wives more difficult, the child more fragile, the church more volatile, and the tomb remained a drawing, a promise, a plan suspended in air above the cold bones of a woman who had done everything she was asked, and had asked for nothing in return. Not even this. Jane lay in the vault while history moved above her. The boy she had died to deliver grew sickly and pale, ruled for 6 years, and died before manhood. The man she had married grew larger and darker, his leg ulcerating, his appetite insatiable, his fury louder than ever. He married again to Anne of Cleves. Briefly, without love then to Catherine Howard, whom he executed, and finally to Catherine Parr, who outlived him and buried what was left. But never again did Henry weep beside a bed, or whisper to a newborn, or design a tomb with such sacred precision, because the part of him that dreamed of immortality in marble had died with Jane. And when, at last, he could no longer stand, no longer rule, no longer pretend that his kingdom was eternal, Henry Tudor, once the golden boy of Christendom, gave his final command, "Bury me beside Jane." It was not a romantic gesture. It was not grief. It was not love. It was control. She was the only one who had not failed him. And so they carried his bloated body through the winter rain, in a coffin that cracked at the seams, leaking rot and regret, and laid him beside her. No ceremony, not trumpet, no queen in black to follow only silence, no monument, no statue, no angels, just wood and stone and stillness. The tomb was never finished. The plans were shelved, the marble left untouched. The masons paid for work they never did, and the drawings, once kept in velvet cases, were lost in floods, in fire, in indifference. Today, there is no grand monument over their bones, only a simple stone slab, bare, carved with their names, shared space for a man who commanded gods and a woman who never raised her voice. They lie there, still the king and the queen, beneath the feet of tourists and monks, beneath choristers who sing without knowing, who listens beneath the stones, beneath centuries of dust and sermons, and the slow settling of forgotten glory. And no one who visits that chapel sees what was meant to be. They do not see the tomb that was promised. They do not see the angels that never stood. They do not see the gold that never shone. But perhaps that is as it should be, because Jane Seymour, in life, had never asked for splendor. She had not sought a crown. She had not demanded a monument. She had been content to stand at the edge of someone else's story, to wait in silence, to hold her place without protest, and perhaps in death. That same silence became her sanctuary. Perhaps the absence of the tomb is her final triumph. No statue, no myth, only memory. And the quiet truth that not every legacy needs marble to last, because even now, 500 years later, her name is spoken not with awe, but with softness, not with fear, but with sorrow. She is not remembered as the scandal, or the seductress, or the survivor. She is remembered as the stillness between storms, the breath after pain, the mother who died too soon, the queen who was never meant to rule, and yet did, quietly, once, and forever. There are women who vanish from history because they were not loud enough to be remembered, and there are women who remain not because they demanded it, but because they became part of something larger than themselves, something no monument can hold, something not made of stone or ink, but of silence, and breath, and the weight of what they left behind. And Jane Seymour was one of those women. She came quietly, like autumn mist through the orchard walls of Wolf Hall, a girl whose hands knew the weave of thread more than the pull of power, who learned to bow before she learned to speak, who waited in rooms filled with noise and never once tried to outshine it. And still the crown found her, not because she chased it, but because she stood still long enough for it to settle upon her brow. And even then, she wore it with the same soft grace she had carried since childhood. As if she knew it did not belong to her for long, she gave the king a son, and he gave her 12 days. She gave England a future, and England gave her a tomb. And still, she did not ask for more. She did not write letters to be read aloud in later centuries, did not carve her name into the foundations of policy or war, did not die with speeches on her lips or banners above her bed. She simply died, as so many women did in those days, with her child in someone else's arms, her husband in another room, and the kingdom moving on before the fever had even cooled. And yet, she remained, in portraits that look back with tired eyes, in vaults that hold her alone, in the mind of a king who married 6 women but chose to lie beside only one. He could not save her even if he had wanted to, even if he had tried, because the crown is not a shield against blood loss or infection or breath that grows too thin to stay. He could not replace her, not truly, because every wife after her was weighed against a ghost. And no living woman can compete with someone already made into memory. He called her his true wife, not because she was the most beloved, but because she was the only one who died before he had time to change his mind. He planned to immortalize her in marble, but never did. He promised to mourn her, and perhaps he did, but he never returned to her chamber, never kissed the cradle where she never rocked her child, never stood above the vault to whisper a name. He never spoke aloud again. Still, he lay beside her, and maybe that was enough, because 5 centuries later, in the hush between breath and sleep, in the gentle rustling of old pages and older prayers, in the pause after the name Henry VIII, someone will say, Jane Seymour, and they will remember not her voice, which was quiet, nor her reign, which was brief, but her absence. Because some women are remembered for what they said, some for what they changed, and some like her for what they left behind. A child, a crown, a silence no one else could fill. And so we close the curtain now, not with fanfare, not with tragedy, but with the soft understanding that sometimes the most enduring legacy is the woman who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. She was the queen he couldn't save, and the one he never truly replaced. Sleep well, Jane. Your name endures